All right. Let's say that you are interviewing people. You have to interview people about an event that happened. Let's say there was a stabbing that happened 2 days ago, and you talk to the witnesses. Now, each witness has their unique contribution. One individual may be shopping when it happened, the other may have been with their partner coming home, the other may be some guy who's just smoking weed around the corner. So they all have their view on what happened. So let's say you compile, you say you have, let's say, 5 interviews, and all the 5 descriptions match. Only one thing doesn't add up. One guy said it was 1 p.m., the other said it was 2 p.m. Now, this is an inconsistency. But then you figure out that the guy who said it was 1 p.m., he just came from Britain, so he didn't change his watch yet. So he still used British time. So that is the 1 hour difference. So now you say, oh, okay, this explains it. So this apparent contradiction wasn't an actual contradiction. You could have explained it away, and you could say the only reason this guy said it was 1 p.m. was because he was still using the British time on his phone. His phone didn't change automatically to Amsterdam time. That is the 1 hour difference. So then you realize, aha, that's it. But if it's only that detail that doesn't match, you can overlook it because it's explained. But if the guy said it was 4 p.m., while it was only 2 p.m., now it becomes a bit unbelievable. Now you know that that guy who just came from another country, even though he came from another country, he can't mistake between 1 p.m. and 4 p.m. Also, the amount of daylight is different. So it comes down to this. When you examine a story and you use all the perspective of all the participants, if there is one detail that you cannot reconcile with the rest, you're going to treat that detail as an outlier. So let's say 5 people witnessed a stabbing. One individual says it was 4 p.m., while all the others said it was 1 p.m. Now, who are you going to believe? Now, you can check CCTV footage of when the ambulance was driving towards the crime scene, and that happened around 1:10 p.m. So now you know that all the people who said it was 1 p.m., that they are correct. The one that said it was 4 p.m., you have to ask yourself, why was the individual mistaken so much? Now you may ask, were they drunk? Were they on drugs? Or did they have any mental episodes, like depression or something that hindered the mental capacity? You're going to ask those questions, because that may explain why this guy was so confused about how late it was. Now, if you find any of such explanations, now you know that this guy has nothing to hide about the situation. He was just not functioning properly. But if you examine all those potential causes of why he may have been confused about the timing, and none of those explanations add up, now you need to come to the logical conclusion that this man has something to hide. And next thing, if the man was drunk or out of his mind, how come all the other details of the stabbing he remembers? Was there another stabbing at 4 p.m.? No. Now, that was just a parable I've used. Now, the same way you need to examine people and circumstances, both current circumstances that are happening right now, as well as past circumstances that you've been through. You need to examine them. Once you encounter one inconsistency, you check the inconsistency to see how you can explain this inconsistency in light with the rest of the story. But once you realize that the inconsistency cannot be explained, one or of two things can be true. Either that inconsistency is an error that you have to remove, so that thing is simply not true, or the whole story doesn't add up. Now I'm giving an example. Let's say a stabbing happened 2 days ago, and there are eyewitnesses who all confirm seeing someone over there, a guy with a hoodie. And then let's say you interview 10 people, and one of them say that they saw a female running away with a knife in her hand. Now, all of them say they saw a guy with a hoodie. And so based on the 9 people saw a guy with a hoodie as suspicious, the police concluded it was the guy with the hoodie they're looking for. But then you look at all the testimonies that they gave, all of the 10 witnesses said the same thing about the crime and about the crime scene, but one of them said they saw a woman running away with a bloody knife. None of the other witnesses saw a woman with a bloody knife, only one. So two things can be the case. Either the one with the bloody knife is the one who did it, and one of the witnesses actually saw the one doing it, and the other people only heard the stabbing, and they saw a man with a hoodie around, and according to their interpretation, it's a man with a hoodie that must be the suspect, because people have a bias to think that perpetrators are often men. Or it can be that one guy or that one girl who says that they saw a woman with a bloody knife running away, that they're making it up just to cover someone. Those are two possibilities you have over here. Now, a third option can be that the guy with the hoodie was involved, but it was the woman who actually stabbed the guy. But anyway, you have 10 witnesses seeing the same thing. One of them mentions a detail that none of the other mentions. Now, it's easy to say, well, 9 out of 10 people say this, so I'm going to dismiss this one thing this one individual said over here. But by doing that, you have a bias towards this man with the hoodie. And now you can focus your whole research on your investigation on a guy with the hoodie, and later you figure out this guy with the hoodie was just someone that passed by. While all along you should have been looking to a woman with a bloody knife. But because of the bias, people think a stabbing, perpetrator, and because they have this bias, perpetrator is male, you went along with this bias. But this bias puts you on the wrong track. What I'm teaching you in this video is that when you trace evidence or you examine the proof of something, you check the inconsistencies. One inconsistency does not automatically mean that everything that was said is false. But that inconsistency can be an eye-opener to reveal something else that doesn't add up. For example, if it's so that a stabbing happened, 10 eyewitnesses were at the crime scene. They saw the victim bleeding, but only 9 of them saw a guy with a hoodie, and one of them just saw a woman with a knife running away. Then that means that those other 9 people were likely not direct witnesses, but they just heard something happening and they checked it out and they saw this guy with the hoodie. Now, this guy with the hoodie could also be a witness. A witness just ran away because he doesn't want to deal with it. But because people saw this guy with the hoodie running away, they automatically assumed he must be the guy. But they haven't seen him with a knife. They haven't seen him with blood on his clothes. Because if you just stab someone, there must be blood on your clothes also. They haven't seen any of that. That one individual who saw a woman with a knife running away, he or she was the one who actually witnessed the few seconds after the crime. So that means that those other people were not alert to the environment. Because how comes only one individual who saw the actual perpetrator, a woman with a knife, but all the others only focused on the guy with the hoodie? That also shows you that the focus of those people was biased. Now, a biased focus does not mean that what they are reporting is false. It simply means that the reporting has a bias. It means that they haven't noticed everything. So, the individual who just looked around without any bias, they noticed things others didn't. So does that mean that individual who noticed a woman with a bloody knife is unreliable? No, he is just as reliable as the other witnesses, but he was some bias in the situation because that he picked up more. So now you can use all 10 eyewitness accounts to reconstruct what happened. But it's easy to say, oh, everyone says a guy with a hoodie. This one guy says a woman with a bloody knife. So this is this one individual. It's very easy to do. But by doing that, you are misleading yourself. And this is the type of bias that often blinds us. You have been raised a certain way by your environment. It's not just your parents that raised you, it's the whole environment, the whole community that raised you a certain way. And because you were raised a certain way, you have a certain outlook on life. Now, the same way you speak a native language, you also have an outlook on life. The native language you speak is not something you did to yourself. It's something you chose. Not something you had no choice. You were shaped into speaking a certain way. That's your native language, whether it's Dutch, French, or Swahili, whatever it is. And based on your native language, you can learn a second language. That's how it goes. The same way, certain expectations are shaped inside of you by your environment. If you grew up in a conservative environment, you likely value hard work and financial autonomy. If you are from a liberal background, you may favor people doing whatever they want with their own bodies, whether it's piercings, abortions, or whatever. Now, you can decide to have a different attitude, but still, even when you decide to have a different attitude, you do it because there's something about the environment that you can't stand. So you're resisting something. And even then, your resistance is based upon how you were shaped. So all of us have been shaped a certain way. So all of us grew up with a certain bias. Now that bias does not mean that whatever you experience or whatever you notice is invalid. It still means there's a bias. And most people are not aware of their bias. They're not. For example, you enter a room, okay, or you're in a room. Someone passes by. They don't say hi. They just pass on. You think, what type of rude individual? He doesn't even say hi. What does he think he is? However, this individual just got news that his mother is on intensive care. And the hospital told him, we're not sure if your mother is going to make it. You hear from us at the end of the day. So this guy just heard terrible news. And because of that, he didn't even notice people around. He just had to go to work, so he just arrived quickly. Now, the employer knows about it because the man informed the employer that his mom's in the hospital and he comes to work, but he doesn't know if he can stay for long. The employer said, just come. If you think you have to go home, go home. Now, the employees are not informed. So because they're not informed, and they see him coming in totally stressed out, not saying hi, they feel rejected. They feel bypassed. Now, based on how they were raised, they consider this man rude. And now, because if they become upset, they begin to think a certain way about him. But those that are aware of what's going on are thinking, no, leave the man alone. Now, other people may say, you know what, maybe the guy didn't say hi because he's stressed out, maybe it's not his day. Leave him. We all have our days that we don't function at our best. But then there are others holding on to how their parents were raised, saying, no, I was raised with manners, you want to be that way. So the way you were shaped by your parents and by your environment, that's the bias you have. And that bias can be used against you. People can easily manipulate you into doing things you otherwise wouldn't do if they know what your bias is. And here's the thing. You don't even have to know what your bias is. Other people can just observe you and notice your bias. And once people notice your bias, they know how to trigger you. If you were raised into believing that the world owes you nothing, but you owe society everything, you have developed to a people's pleaser. So now the only people have to do is to accuse you of being selfish or to be or show angry face to you often, and that triggers you to blame yourself and to cooperate with other people. If you grew up in an environment where your parents were antisocial, you tend to be more cautious. So in that case, when people show angry face and all of that, you tend to think, is it me or is it you? So your bias, and your bias can also be the result of lack of understanding. Your bias can be due to ignorance or due to neglect. Your bias can also be due to trauma. If you had parents who were quite harsh on you, you may have developed all types of coping mechanisms on how to deal with rejection and pain that are unhealthy. But that bias hinders you from seeing when people are taking advantage of you. So that bias is the result of trauma. Now, it doesn't matter what your bias is, whether it's just by lack of understanding or by ignorance or by trauma. Whatever the root or cause of the bias is there. The moment you're aware of your bias, you now realize that you are responsible for rectifying the bias. If you have this short fuse that you're impatient with other people because your own parents just had no patience with you, well, now you know that your parents were out of their mind. Now you realize that your parents put a lot of pressure on you that wasn't healthy. So now you developed this short fuse also, but now you realize this short fuse is wrong, you go to therapy and you do something about it. That's how it should be. Once you're aware of your bias, you must do something about it. Because that bias can get you in trouble. That bias can get others in trouble. That bias can be used against you. And if that bias goes against the will of the Heavenly Father, it's darkness and you need to be delivered from it. Unfortunately, most people out there have no interest in facing their bias because their bias is what they consider natural and inevitable. Someone may say, well, I just don't like certain people. I just don't. That's just the way I feel. Okay, but why do you feel that way? You dislike certain people. Those certain people are the people who don't do what you want. Everyone who does what you want, you like them. People who don't do what you want, you just dislike them for some reason. Or it may be that you can't stand certain people. And then when a psychologist examines you, he figures out that all those people you dislike have one thing in common. They look like your mother, or they look like your father. They remind you of something that triggers you. So the issue is not those other people, it's you. So you being angry with those people, taking action against those people, is you actually projecting your trauma onto them and escalating on them. It's a form of relief seeking. You're relieving yourself by escalating on those people so you don't have to look at yourself. And that's wrong. It's a crime. Those other people are not responsible for the triggers you have. Now, those people are responsible for being considered towards you, but you should consider them also. So you must take responsibility. Look, all of us have a bias that was developed inside of us. All of us. You are not responsible for the bias that was developed inside of you. But besides that, despite that you're not responsible for it, now that you're older, now that you've lived longer, you now have the ability and the potential to rectify the bias, and that is on you. That your parents were poor, you can't blame yourself for that. No. But now you realize that your parents were poor, you can decide to escape poverty or to have a better life. If your parents were cruel, narcissistic, and without any decency, you don't have to remain with the traumas they caused you. You can get help and become better. The sad thing is, a lot of people out there The rule is amongst common people is that they don't want to see their own bias. They want to hang around people with the same bias. Because people with the same bias are not going to challenge you. And because they're not challenged, they're comfortable. That's what most people want, just want relief. They don't want to be challenged. They only want people around them that share their bias. People that don't reflect their bias, they avoid them. Because people that don't have the same bias as them is going to notice things about them they don't want to notice about themselves. So this whole social distance that people generate between them and other people is just there to prevent them from having to face themselves. And this relief seeking, this avoidance of facing yourself, it's pathological. And at some point, it's going to become extreme. It's going to get out of hand. But what happens when this avoidance gets out of hand? People just change their social ties. For example, they may unfriend people or block people or move to another town, and then they will look for other people with a similar pattern again. They say they started over, yes, they started the cycle over, but they haven't actually healed and haven't actually moved on. They are not delivered, they haven't processed anything, so they haven't moved forward. They're still in the same chapter in their life, but they restart the chapter with someone else. And that's what most people do. They restart the same chapter of their lives with other people. For example, a woman can be married to someone, and now she's unhappy in the marriage because the marriage doesn't reflect her expectations. Instead of her considering whether his expectations are correct or not, instead of taking opportunity of the moment to learn, instead of realizing this is a learning moment to become better, she now wants to flee. And she asks for a divorce. Or she cheats on the man just to end the marriage, and now she moves on with her lover. But then, while being with his lover, she will encounter the same issues as she did with her ex-husband. And now she does again and again and again. She goes from husband to husband, boyfriend to boyfriend, and it's always the fault of those people that she was involved with. She's always complaining about her exes. Now, at some point, people are going to notice, hold on a minute, you had 5 boyfriends already, or you have 5 husbands. It cannot be it's only them. And if it's always them, how come you keep ending up with such people? If you keep complaining that all your exes were men that lacked ambition, how come you never recognize a man with ambition? Because there are many men with ambition walking around. How come you never recognize a man with ambition? So somewhere there's something that's lacking in you. There's some dysfunction that you have. There's something lacking in you that needs to be addressed. And this is what you need to watch out for. A lot of people, they don't want the truth about themselves. They don't want to look in the mirror. They don't want to see where they are lacking. They really don't. All their lives they've been running away from facing themselves. All their lives they've been running away from seeing themselves in the mirror. So if they made all the effort to avoid facing themselves, some do it by just literally walking away and ghosting people. Others do it by being violent and aggressive towards people. Those are the so-called blunt people who just escalate on you when they're uncomfortable and then say, well, I'm just being honest. And here's the thing. Such people are only blunt and directed that way with people they can get away with. They won't do that to a police officer. They won't do that to a judge in a courthouse. And they won't do that to someone who can knock them out. Where someone is avoiding but just escalating on people verbally in a violent way, or someone just ghosting, it's both fleeing. Most people out there don't want to look in the mirror and face themselves. They don't want to see their own lack. They don't want to see their inner poverty. Instead, they project their inner poverty on someone else, and then they feel comfortable victimizing that other individual to be at ease. This is not something only individuals do. Whole groups of people do this also. For example, it can be that there aren't enough houses built in a country to house everyone. So there's a housing crisis. But whose fault is that there's a housing crisis? The local population. And the government that governs the local population. They allowed it to come so far. But now, Because the public doesn't want to face this defect of their own community and how they allowed it to come so far, now they get upset with the foreigners or the asylum seekers, saying, because those migrants and those asylum seekers, we can't have enough housing for our people. We need to have stricter border controls. We need to protect our borders. So this whole obsession with protecting borders is just a diversion from facing that we failed as a community. They don't want to look the children in the eyes and say, Mom and Dad and all the other adults failed you. We're sorry. They don't want that. So instead, they become militant in keeping migrants and refugees out. Or it can be that there is this zero tolerance policy on crime. A lot of people go to prison for minor offenses just to scare off people from doing crime. Why is there a zero tolerance policy to begin with? Well, many of the children in that community were abused. Some sexual abuse, other physical abuse. They were abused by their parents, and the community did not intervene. Now, many of those children, those abuse happened around 20 years ago. So those children are now grown-ups. And a lot of those grown-ups have a lot of mental issues. And what happens is, those grown-ups with mental issues, they're not violent people, but they're being taken advantage of by criminals. Now, who deformed those adults? The community did. So who made those people easy targets for criminals? The community did. So now the community doesn't want to face that they have so many defective people amongst them. So to cover up their neglect, they'll be very hard on crime, just to give those defective adults the feeling the community cares about you. Well, the community just wants to cover up their neglect. So it isn't just individuals who are doing this. Whole groups do it also. They don't want to face their bias. And they don't want any politician, nor any journalist, nor any preacher, nor any other public figure point out their bias. They don't. They will ghost you when you do that, or they will attack you. They just want to be left alone. They just want to be relieved. That's how the world is. That's what society is. People don't want to face their bias. It doesn't matter whether bias is something extreme or something that is just a small error. A bias is a bias, and a bias can be used against you. You should be aware of your bias to outgrow your bias. Now, some people go from one bias to the other. First they're liberals, now they are conservative, or first they are, progressive, and now they're quite traditional. So it's easy to shift from one bias to the other. But it's not easy to face the fact that life requires you to be flexible and practical. Because once you realize that life has to be flexible and practical, you realize that you can't do it on your own. And instead you realize you need Christ. You need the Heavenly Father. You realize how dependent you are. And that's the thing with fallen mankind. Fallen mankind has this obsession with avoiding their own vulnerability. Especially the fact that they have mortal bodies. But apart from the fact that they have mortal bodies, fallen mankind doesn't want to embrace their own vulnerability. Because the vulnerability implies that they can be taken advantage of or overlooked. So fallen mankind wants compensation in a form of violence or in the form of trickery. And it's this compensation seeking that keeps all the violence, all the dark, all the evil that we see in the world. The only way to outgrow and unlearn this compensation seeking is by serving the Heavenly Father and relying on Christ's provision. And this is the thing a lot of people don't want to do because they need to look in the mirror and face their bias. Well, everyone needs to face their bias. And remember, you're not responsible for that bias developing in you. No, but you are responsible for facing it and outgrowing it. You not facing your bias and therefore remaining dysfunctional and defective makes you a perpetrator, an enabler of violence and evil around you. You may not be evil yourself, no, but you still are an enabler of the evil because you're not willing to outgrow your own bias. Now, there are adults who are not even aware of their bias. They're not awakened yet. Then you have people in their teens who are awakened. It doesn't matter when someone's awakened. The moment an awakening happens, the individual becomes responsible to outgrow and to improve. If they refuse to do that, they become a perpetrator. And the more they refuse to outgrow their bias, the more narcissistic someone becomes. So don't just look at age. Even though it's reasonable to expect someone that's 30 to be more advanced than someone that's 20. There are exceptions, but in general, it's like this. The longer someone's alive, the more reality has shown them in a rude way that they're lacking. So the older someone becomes and they remain defective, it's likely that they've become an enabler of the evil around them. Now, someone can be 50 and still not aware they have a bias. Now, that's quite rare, but it can happen. And once they awaken at age 50, they become better people. Now, some people are 20 and they realize that they're lacking and they don't want to face this. And at age 25, they're already a reprobate. So I don't want to use age as a rule here, but just use age as a guideline. If someone is beyond age 25 and they're still not aware or don't want to consider their own bias, it is because likely they're on their way to reprobation. So beware of that. Well, anyway, thanks for listening to this message. Keep agreeing with Christ. Be at peace, and I'll see you next time.